students and parents to part two. And I'm going to do my best in this one not to bore you to tears, but this one does get a little bit longer because I am going to do my best to explain our grading practices that we use in our chemistry program. Um, so it does warrant some explanation because we do use a 0 to 5 scale, which is likely different from the vast majority of teachers your students have had in the past. So students will still get a classic grade mark, A, B, C, D, or F, and everything in between. So that part is not different. What is different is how we go about deciding or assigning uh, a letter grade to a student. And I just want to have this running theme that is not based on percentages. All right. So if you happen to see that your son or daughter scored a 0 on an assignment, now that could mean one of two things. It could mean they just flat out didn't do it, in which case I or their chemistry teacher would be getting on their case to get that done ASAP. But it might also mean that if it were, let's say, a test or an essay or a project that they did complete and still received a 0, that would mean that that student did not demonstrate learning or any sort of mastery whatsoever of whatever standard it is that we were asking them to address in that test or project. All right. Now, likewise, if you see a 5, all right, so a 5 will put them in that A range, right? And again, we're getting away from this idea of percentages. So a 5 does not mean that a student wrote a perfect paper or got a perfect score on a test. What a 5 means is that a student showed a very high level of mastery of that standard, and therefore, as a team of chemistry teachers, we decided that that level of mastery warrants an A. Okay. And not to beat a dead horse here, but I do want to talk about a 3 because this is where percentages might start to confuse people. So a 3 means that a student showed enough learning to receive a B. Now, when you see a score of a 3, we do not want to think of that as a 3 out of 5, right? Yes, a 5 is the maximum score, but it's not like we're subtracting points and then assigning a 3. Uh, 3 is about this being a level of mastery. Now, a 3 out of 5 typically would be equal to a 60%, right? 60% is typically barely passing, all right? In our grading scale, a 3 is actually a fairly good score. Because what the 3 means is that they met standard. Now, they didn't blow it out of the water. They weren't necessarily able to synthesize topics at a very high level, but we're very comfortable saying, you know what, that student has a solid foundational understanding, right? And therefore it gets a 3, right? So a 3 out of 5 is 60% sends a very different message from a 3 which corresponds to a solid understanding B. And that's why we're going through the pains of kind of trying to make sure you guys understand what this looks like. Now, that being said, in this course, we are going to be weighting the different types of assignments that we do based on how much mastery is required of them. Right? So under our system, we're going to go 60% of the student's grade is a summative grade. So those summative things are when we expect mastery, right? So typically at the end of a topic or the end of a unit, we're going to ask the students to complete a traditional test, but it might also be a presentation or a project or an essay, and in some cases, lab reports. All right, 60% of their grade will come from that. 30% is formative, which you might want to consider as the processes that we use to help get students to that mastery point. So that would be our daily work, practice quizzes, homework, etc. Right? And then our building principal has asked us to also include 10% weighting toward professionalism, which while it's not a chemistry specific standard, we do think that we want all kids leaving WaHi with some sort of understanding that yes, attendance and punctuality important, getting things, assignments done on time also important. So while that's a relatively small portion of the grade, it does allow us time to assess that for you and give kids some feedback as to how they're doing in that regard. Now, with that being said, I'm going to throw one more context at you, and I'm going to compare two students uh, with scores. So both students are scored under a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 scale, right? But by weighting scores, these two students end up with very different grades than we did if they were not weighted. So if we just did a traditional average, so even though we're using our non-traditional 0 to 5 scale, if I were just to average a 5, a 1, and a 1, right, that would come out to 2.3, which would put this student right in the middle of that C range. All right. Now, student A here received a very high score on that summative, which means that while they're probably pretty unreliable about getting things in on time or complete, right, they still managed to learn at a very high level, at least in this one instance. Now, compare that with student B. Student B scored a 1 on that summative, right, which would show very little understanding of the standard at hand, but they may be your typical teacher pleaser, that they're always getting things done and turned in on time and always participating uh, and everything. Those are very good skills to have, by the way. But sometimes we have students that rely on that and then do a very superficial job of actually learning the material. Now, under a traditional weighting, this student would be at a 3.7 B plus, right? Now we have two students. This student actually learned at a much higher level than this student, but the grades, the way they are assigned, do not send that message. Therefore, by weighting our scores at 60% in the summative column, 30% formative, and 10% professionalism, we actually end up with student A receiving a B and student B receiving a C. So even though student B did a great job about just turning stuff in, that student needs to learn to focus their energy on the learning at a high level because that is not indicative of a solid understanding of the standards at hand, right? So that is why we weight the scores the way we do, and why we use that 0 to 5 scale. We feel it's a better way to assess kids' progress and a better way for them to approach their learning. Now, just a quick bit about late work and retakes. So most assignments are required to be completed by the due date in order to receive full credit. We will accept late work up until the corresponding summative test or project. So we do a chunk of learning over 1 or 2 weeks, or maybe sometimes even longer. Eventually, we're going to have a test or project or presentation that asks them to show what they learned. On the day of that test or project or presentation, that is the last day students may turn in work from that topic or unit, right? We will not accept anything after that point. Uh, Likewise, if a student does a summative and they're not pleased with the score they got, we will provide opportunities to retake or revise. And sometimes redo assessments, but it is going to be more or less on a case-by-case basis. We're asking the students show a level 5 in both the formative and professionalism to earn the right in order to retake or revise. Although, like I said before, it will be on a case-by-case basis, and we're not going to be real firm on that. Um, that takes us to the end of this. Again, if you have questions, please email or call, and I can hopefully give you more information.